So moving on to today's session, we're going to be looking at antibody identification, which is a core element of all of our work. And we're lucky to be joined by Helen Thom today, who is a specialist biomedical scientist with lots of experience in red cell immunohematology. She works with NHS Blood and Transplant, currently looking after hospitals in London as a customer service manager, but has lots of years experience working in the ICI laboratories. She's very knowledgeable, very passionate, and has a love for all things blood group serology. So I'm going to hand over now to Helen Thom to get today's meeting started. Helen, feel free to take control, and it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me back to do another talk. I do enjoy, I love training, and it is really nice to get invited, and this is my 5th one of these talks now, so thank you for having us, and I hope you find it interesting. Hopefully you might have had a chance to do some of the antibody IDs, which I sent out in advance, but if you don't worry, because we're going to go through them all. You can always complete them afterwards, and if you've got any queries, I don't mind you contacting me afterwards. So today, and I have to give credit to Danny and Selma for the title of this one, is Fantastic Antibodies and How to Find Them, the Tales of ABID. So I'm just going to start off with an outline. So we're just going to do an antibody. What is an antibody identification? Why it's important? We're going to have a look at some panels, and then we're going to do a poll at the end. So pay attention, because we will be asking you some questions, just really for me to see if you've understood the talk, and hopefully you'll enjoy it as well. So I'm not going to talk about ABO and RHD and things like that. This is just purely antibody identification. Obviously groups will come into it, but that's not the process I'm going to take you through today. So essentially what we're looking for is we just want to see if a patient has made any antibodies when you're going to give them any blood products, or see the effect on a pregnancy or something like that. So hopefully you can see my cursor. So got the patient's plasma, and that's where the antibodies are. And you're just going to mix it with some red cells, and then hopefully you're all familiar with this card here, which is column agglutination technology. Mix them together, incubate it for 15 minutes at 37 degrees, so you're mimicking what's going on in the body. Stick it in a centrifuge and then see what comes out of the other side. But I just want to take a little close look of what's actually happening here. So when you're performing an antibody screen or an antibody panel, what we're actually doing is an indirect antiglobulin test. So what this is when you have your red cells and the antibodies from your patient plasma, when you mix them together, because the IgG, they're really small and they're not actually big enough to cause agglutination and bring red cells together. They'll just sensitize them. So what you need to do is you actually need to bridge the gap. And in this case, it's the time bridge, because you may guess that I'm from up Newcastle, so anyone here will recognise the time bridge. So I was just thinking of ways that you need to bridge the gap. So obviously we don't have 2 giant red cells attached to the time bridge, but if you can just think of this as you can't bring these together, you just need something in between, so that when you do centrifuge it, you are actually going to cause agglutination. And this is where the IAT part of it comes in, because you're adding a reagent to it to indirectly agglutinate your antibodies. That's the way I like to think about it. And this is your anti-IgG. So when you're looking at your cards and you've got the green stuff in the cards, or you can do it in tubes and you would add it out of a bottle, that is what you're doing. You're using a reagent to bridge the gap, and it causes agglutination. And in this case, we use anti-human globulin, and it's green, so that's why it's green. So people have various names for it. We call it green stuff. Past the green stuff, or the cards are already green. So just a little bit of background there for you. So go back to our antibody screen. So we've got patient's plasma, your red cells. Some of these, if there's antibodies there, these cells are going to be positive. It's going to bind using your bridging antibodies, and when you centrifuge them, you get agglutination. And this is probably what you're more familiar with. This is what you're going to see in a card. So if screen 1 is positive, you've got this reaction in the card here, and 2 and 3 are negative. So great, some things there, you've got a positive antibody screen, but what does it mean? It doesn't really tell you specifically what's going on. So this is when you want to do your antibody panels. These are much more specific and will give you a good idea of what's going on. So having a look at your BSH guidelines, you've got, when you make a panel, it's got to be done in a certain way. So it needs to be group O, because you don't want any interference from any blood group ABO antigens, or antibody, sorry. For your commonly encountered clinically significant antibodies, so these are the ones that are going to cause your transfusion reactions, and you want to confirm these, you've got to have 2 positive examples within the panel and 2 antigen negative examples within the panel for all of the antibodies. Sorry, someone's in there that can't see the shared screen. Might be worth logging out and rejoining if you want, if you've lost the connection. Yeah, so you've got to have 2 positive examples and 2 negative examples, because that's what you need to actually confirm the presence of an antibody. You can't just have 1 cell and say that's enough. You've got to have a combination of certain particular cell profiles. So you've got to have an R1R1. You've also got to have an R1WR1, which is a CW positive cell. Between these 2, they've got to express big K, little k, Duffy A, Duffy B, JK, JKB, big S and little s between these R1R1 and R1RW. And you've also got to have 1 example of an R2R2 cell. You've also got to have an R-r, which is D negative but big C positive, and then an R double dash, which is big E positive, D negative, so on and so forth. I won't expect you to remember all of this, and I do apologise if I dive into shorthand. Then you've also got to have 3 examples of D negative cells, and one of these has got to be K-pos, and these also have to express between them little k, your kids, your s's, and your duffies. So that's just why the panels are set up in the way that they are. Most panels that I'm familiar with anyway will be a 10-cell panel, but you've got to have a minimum of 8. So then you go on to your exclusions. So once you've identified an antibody and that patient's got an antibody, it's really important to exclude the presence of any further ones, because if you miss anything, you could have a hemolytic transfusion reaction. So you've got the person sitting in the bed here saying, I have a feeling of impending doom. Apparently that's what patients report when they're having a transfusion reaction. And it's so short of saying things that were reported to them where if people have had these reactions, there's a failure to exclude these antibodies. What you've also got to be aware of is within your cell, within your panels, you've got to use, for your exclusions, you have to use cells which they refer to as homozygous expression. So even though homozygous is a gene, what it actually is referring to is, say if you wanted a homozygous JK positive cell, you've got, it's JK pos, JKB neg. So you've got to have that. You couldn't have a heterozygous one would be JK pos, JKB pos. You can't, for your duffies, your s's and your kids, you've got to have homozygous expression. And then BSH are saying that you only need a single example of each phenotype to exclude your antibodies. I personally like 2. But the difference is when you're in reference, you see all sorts of weird and wonderful things, so I just feel comfortable with 2, but you can just use 1 for your exclusions. There's things that we're going to also help out with. So when you're doing your antibody ID, performing your IET, you can treat the enzymes with PAPAIN. So most of the time you'll use a 10-cell IET panel and a 10-cell enzyme panel. That may be enzyme in neutral cards, or it may be an enzyme IET, which is what they use in the reference labs because they're really good for detecting kid antibodies. So some antigens are sensitive to PAPAIN. So someone once told me that one way to get rid of them is to just chop them. Think of it as a wood chopper coming along and chopping the antigens off the cell. This is what PAPAIN treatment does. So you can see there you've got your duffies, your M and your S's. M and an S it's gone when you add the PAPAIN cells. And you PAPAINize the cells even. So what this does in turn is whatever's left over is you can have enhanced reactions because you've got stuff out the way so the antibody can essentially just get a hold of it a bit better. So these are much stronger reactions, and that's an actual picture of me doing some weights there. So I'll let you know. So what's for PAPAIN treatment? One way I thought about trying to explain this is, think of your red cell antigens as trees. So you've got all these trees on your red cell, and you've got an antibody here trying to bind. So say if this was anti-D, it's trying to bind your anti-D, which is in red there, but it can't quite get a hold of it. So you'll get a reaction, but it's not very strong. It might be like a 1 or a 2+. But then you bring in your little woodcutter. So this is your PAPAIN. So when you're using your PAPAIN cells, it gets rid of the ones that are sensitive. So you lose your duffies and your M, N and S's, and it can actually just get a hold of it. So it cleaves these ones here. Then you've got your big strong reactions, and everything else is like, yeah, you can get a hold of that. And that's how you get your enhanced reaction. So just think of it as you've chopped the trees down and you can get a better hold of them. See what's going on underneath. hopefully that makes sense. Sorry, there was a comment came up there. I thought it was probably quite relevant. I missed what it was. You all right to read that one out, Danny, there?
Yeah, sure. So a comment from one of the delegates. BTLP TACT doesn't let me exclude anti-JKA with an enzyme panel. So more of a comment than a question there.
Yeah, for that one, actually, according to BMSEDG guidelines, you can only exclude RH antibodies using an enzyme panel, but it's part of the thing that I'll go through in the talk today. It's having that knowledge and understanding of how things work, and it depends if you use an enzyme IAT or not, but the guidelines do state that it's only supposed to be RH guidelines which you're allowed to exclude by enzyme. So another tool that we have, so we've got your grading. So when you're recording your positive reactions, there's some tube examples on the top there, but probably more familiar with the colm-agglutination reactions on the bottom. So if you've got a strong reaction, it's a 5, or you might only grade a 4 within your laboratory, and these would just shift along slightly. So you've got like strong positives, then a sort of medium reaction and getting weaker, and then you go to a negative. These are really useful if you've got multiple antibodies present, because if you grade your reactions, if you've got a load of 5s or a load of 4s, and then you've got some 1s, it can help you see there might be different things going on. It's also really good for identifying your enhanced reactions. So if something's a lot stronger by enzyme, you have that knowledge of how that antibody behaves, so it can confirm the presence of an antibody. If it's weaker by IAT and stronger by enzymes, or it's gone by enzymes. And it's also good for dosage, which is when we're looking at the homozygous expression and heterozygous expression, and hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate that for you when we go through the antibody panels. So here I've got some tools of the trade. So we've already discussed what antibody panels, we've discussed with screening, we've talked about PAPAINization. You can also phenotype your person. So if you find out your patient, see if you find out that they've made an antibody, you can find out whether it's an autoantibody or an alloantibody. But you have to bear in mind, if a patient's been transfused recently, you're unable to phenotype them because there'll be a population of patient cells and donor cells, so it's dual population. And your donor cells, if they've made an antibody, are going to be antigen positive for that antibody, so you'd get a false positive result, so you can't use that. Another way you can get a false positive result with your phenotyping reagents, because some are IgM, which is great, and some are IgG, which is also great. But when you use IgG anti-sera for phenotyping, if your patient's got an IgG positive DAT, that means that your patient has IgG bound to the red cells. Could be an autoantibody, could be to do with any illness and things that they've got. They could just be positive. Might just be one of those few patients that's that positive, or it could be because they've had a transfusion. But that can actually interfere with the IgG anti-sera, so that's also something that's worth bearing in mind when you are phenotyping a patient. Yeah, I've just got your brain, so this is you. You've got your knowledge and your understanding, which you might not think of it as being a tool in antibody ID, but it is. It's you understanding your guidelines, understanding how reaction antibodies work and things like that. It's really important to get a patient history, because you need to know if your patient's been transfused, what kind of patient they are. And then you've got your BMSEDG guidelines, so these are always refer to them, check your SOPs, local documentation. And then I've got the genotype in here, so essentially if all else fails, you can get a genotype for your patient, and that can help you to identify auto and antibodies and alloantibodies. So hopefully that makes sense. So is there any questions before we start doing antibody IDs? Nope. Silence is golden. So I'm just going to take you through how I would do an antibody ID. So it's a case of doing all your inclusions and your exclusions. So what I would do, I tend to start down the right hand side with the kid antibodies, and I move down. I'm hoping you can see my cursor. I move down until I find a positive reaction. Then I move along, and if this was negative, I've got a positive reaction here and a negative reaction there, so I can say that I've excluded the presence of the antibody because the cell's antigen positive, but the corresponding antibody, it's not a positive reaction there, so I can get rid of it. But on this one, I can't. So I have to continue on down to the next positive, move along. There we go, that's negative. Great. Get me pen and I strike a little line through it. You don't have to do it like this. Some people can just look and they'll see themselves, but that's just how I do it. Then I move down to the next one, go along. Oh, someone's saying there that they can't see my cursor. Hopefully it's making sense without the cursor if you can't see that. Right, there seems to be a cursor issue. Any better? That working?
It seems to be working fine, Helen.
Is it? Right. Sorry if you can't see it, I'll just talk through it. So I've moved through and hopefully you can see that I've drawn a little line through that. And then what I do is get my pen and cross it out at the top. So this is just a visual way of me knowing that I've got rid of it. So then I move down onto the next one. There's the next line, go down, cross it out. There's another one, cross that out. Oh, thanks for letting us know you can see it. So I can get rid of GK. So on and so forth, and I've got lots of clicks here, and then this is a point where I've probably got sick of doing my animations, so I have just excluded all of these. So bit trigger happy. Then you get to the last, so I'm now on my last column. So right, move down here, look, that's positive, can't exclude it. Move down to the next one, that's positive, I can't exclude it. Move down to the next one, positive. Oh, and it's actually looking like this antibody's there because you're past the point of exclusion, you're now matching the pattern of reactions. So it's pretty much looking like there's an anti-D present. My patient's autoantibody is negative because an autoantibody is a useful tool because this can indicate whether the patient's been recently transfused, whether they've got an autoantibody, just something worth bearing in mind. So there is an anti-D here, but I need more tools. I need more tools in order to find out if this is an alloantibody or an autoantibody. And what you may or may not have noticed is we haven't actually done all our exclusions because this cell is CW positive. And within the blood service, we tend not to have a line that has a single, like we don't have a separate one for CW, but you may on your own panels. So going back to those tools, so I need to know my phenotype of the patient, because if the patient's phenotype is D negative, this is going to be an alloantibody. But I also need to know the patient's history. Have they been transfused recently? Is there any dual population? And in this case, they haven't been transfused. They have had a previous pregnancy. The patient's phenotype is D negative, so they're little r, big K neg. So this I would call an alloanti-D based on that, but it's not just the antibody ID, it's knowing the patient's history as well. And there you go. So I don't know if anyone wants to have a go at what blood you would issue for this patient.
Just while we're waiting for people to come in there, Helen, just a question here from Harry Gaskin. At NHSBT, are all panels done by automated method?
Some are done by automated method. When I started, we used to do everything manually, but there has been an increase in work, so it tends to be for antenatal patients, with straightforward, simple antibodies. They will be done by automation, but if you've got a complex patient, it will be done manually. Some of the reference patients are done manually. A lot of it, first-time patients, we might put by automation just so we can see getting like that high throughput, I suppose, in the same way as you would in the hospitals. I mean, I'm not currently in a reference lab, so I can't comment what the exact process is at the moment. But the last time that I was in the reference lab, we would do some of the more simple antibody IDs by automation, but you may then need to follow and go and perform that manually. They might need tube IAT. You can get some patients who are very sensitive on the machine, and you'll sort of just get like mildly pan-reactive, but then you can do the same test manually and you don't seem to get that. So I hope that makes... Sorry, this one was just an example. The next ones are... You'll have the next one. Sorry, I should have said at the beginning. So I hope that makes sense, but you could always contact your local reference lab and ask what they do, but it depends on the patient. If we've seen them previously and we know that they're going to be pan-reactive by automation, there would be no point replicating that because you want to conserve your plasma. So obviously it's a limited resource and you don't want to have to re-bleed someone just because you've used the technique that you don't necessarily need to. So I don't know if anyone did want to come in with an answer for the blood there, but I'll just jump ahead. So this patient here, they've made anti-D. So what you might know is with, yes, Craig, you would give B little r, big K neg, thank you. Because this patient has made an RH antibody. Once they've made an RH antibody, you then match for your extended RH, so your C's and your E's So big C, little e, little e. As for your K, this patient is a 57-year-old female, so they're not of childbearing potential. So you would have to check what your local policy is, but you don't have to give big K negative. But what some people do is once they've made an antibody, they might prevent further stimulation of alloantibodies. So you could give big K negative, but you wouldn't have to. But again, check your local policy. And I think that's it for this slide.
Helen, there's a question here.
Yeah.
It says, what do you mean by the control line at the bottom in addition to the auto control?
Sorry, I should have said. I think it's one of these. I know what it means, so I've just automatically assumed everyone else would. So the positive control is just an incubation control. So when we perform manual, in my head I've done these all manually. When we perform a manual antibody ID, we have to put an incubation control up. So this would just be a positive cell, an antigen positive cell. I would tend to use, say, line 2 against a weak anti-K anti-sera, just to show that the incubation has worked. Because if you got a result where this was completely negative, how do you know without doing an incubation control that the tests actually worked? So it's just a way of confirming that your tests worked. I hope that helps. So we're just going to move on to our first antibody ID. So for this one, within RCI, we use the same format for our R1, R1s and little r, they're always 1 to 10. So 1's always CW pos, R1, R1, 2, etc., etc. So whenever you have certain antibodies, you can sort of look at the pattern. So for this one, I haven't gone through and done all the little lines just to sort of save time. So I have just matched the pattern up. So I'm hoping it'll make sense when I do it. But if you've done all your exclusions on it and written them all down, that's fine. It's just quite difficult when you're doing all the animations. It takes quite a long time. So for this one, I've just matched up the pattern. So I've got line 3 is positive, and then I've got a 3+ reaction by IAT, and I've got a 5+ reaction by enzyme IAT. And I've highlighted these both in green at the end just to make sure that you're aware that I'm using enzyme IAT here rather than the enzymes in the neutral cards, which some of you may use within your own laboratory. I've also got line 5 positive, again, enhanced reactions, and I've excluded the presence of everything else. So this is looking like it's a big E. So hopefully everyone else has the same. And again, just always think, right, I've got my antibody, what tools do I need now? So you need to know your patient's phenotype. So you could do this, a lot of the time it's done by automation, or you could do it manually. And it's just having this understanding here. So we've got what IAT, it's looking like a big E, and you would know that RH is enhanced. And when you're looking at your PAPAIN treatment, RH is enhanced by PAPAIN treatment. So when you're looking there, RH is enhanced by PAPAIN treatment, kind of confirms that it's a big E. Or it was negative, but still important to know your patient's transfusion history. And this patient was transfused 2 years ago. But you still need to know what kind of patient this is. Are they pregnant? Do they need an antibody titration or anything like that? It's looking like an alloantibody big E. We need to know the patient's phenotype. It's a 48-year-old male, and the phenotype is A pos, little c neg, big E neg, which is an R1, R1, and the K pos. So now you've identified this, you know it's an alloantibody. You don't need to do anything else. What blood are you going to issue at this point? If anyone would like to jump in, feel free. So I've got an A. So what A would you give? A positive, A negative, A pos, big E neg. Any other takers? A R1, R1, Kel pos, yeah. Yeah, AR1, R1 again, yeah. Yep.
E neg. E neg.
Just big E neg. Would you give, if you were going to give a group A big E neg, would you give a little r, so a D negative, which would be little c positive? No, for this patient, you would have to give a R1, R1. You don't have to give K negative, 1 because the patient's K positive, and 2 it's a 48-year-old male. But because they've made an RH antibody, you have to further give RH match, so you would need a match for the little c. because once they've made an antibody, they can make another antibody. So for this person, using your BMSEDG guidelines, you would have to issue R1, R1. So this patient, if you gave them little r, which would be little c negative, it's little c positive, you could risk stimulating an anti-little c. I hope that makes sense to everybody. So this is why I said it's important to understand the patient history, how your antibodies work, what your guidelines say and things. So congratulations, you've found your first antibody. So it's an RH antibody, which, as I've said there, these are just sort of taken from your BMSEDG guidelines. So it's enhanced by PAPAIN. Once you've found an RH antibody, you'd match for your C's and E's. Anti-D is the most clinically significant and it's the most immunogenic after ABO. It's the most significant antibody in terms of HDFN, and you need to give antigen-negative blood if you found it. Your big C and little c, these are, again, clinically significant antibodies, and both indicating HDFN, particularly anti-little c, and unlike anti-D, there isn't an anti-little c prophylaxis. That would be very useful if someone did make that. Then you've got your same with your big E and your little e, so you do need to give antigen-negative blood. And there are lots of other RH antibodies. Can't remember off the top of my head how many they are, but some of them may be clinically significant. So say something like an anti-CW, that may be clinically significant, but you can just get away with giving cross-match compatible by IAT. You don't have to give antigen-negative blood because about 97% of your donor population are going to be negative for anti-CW. So you don't have to specifically select CW neg. So if everyone's happy with that, I'm just going to move on to the next one, just because I'm aware of time and I don't want work to run out today, and I'd like to cover everything if I can. So
Helen, sorry, there was a question whether the patient is transfusion dependent.
Even with that patient, if they were transfusion dependent, you would still give extended RH matched, even if they were not going to have another transfusion ever again. You would still advise that they would need little c negative blood, because it's extended RH match once you've made an RH antibody, and that patient would be issued with an antibody card that would say that they needed to have R1 R1 blood, even though they've only got the big A neg antibody, the anti-E. I hope that helps them. So moving on to the next one. So what I've done here, I have already done your exclusions for your enzyme antibodies. So that kind of goes back to the point that someone made previously, how you can't exclude anti-JK, your KID antibodies using enzyme technique, which you can't because that does go against the guidelines. But I've already gone through and I have excluded these just for purposes of this talk. I haven't excluded KPA by IAT. It is gone by enzyme, but I technically can't exclude it. But what I've done is gone, well, actually with KPA, that's one of those where it's classed as sort of, and the same with ELUATE, and I've circled that as well, unlikely to be clinically significant, or you could say your KPA may be clinically significant, but that's one of those ones. It's similar to CW with the antigen within the population. You're going to, it's like 97-98% of people are going to be antigen negative, so you can just go for cross-match compatible by IAT. So we'll move on to our next antigens and start with exclusions. So gone with the WB there, gone along and I exclude that, but you can only do it on one. Personally, if this was my antibody ID, I'd be inclined to see what I've found and then put another cell up just to get a second exclusion, but you don't have to, but that's just my weird antibody obsession. Excluded my WA, great. Oh, obviously done an animation out of sync there, which I hadn't spotted. Then I've excluded my little S fab, that's all gone. Excluded big S, great, that one's gone as well. Continue on, move down, that's gone, fab. Now we're sort of getting in the territory where we're like, right, could be an antibody here. So, going with anti-N, go down there, got a positive reaction here. It's negative by enzyme IAT, and I'll be thinking, well, anti-M, it's destroyed by enzyme. Then I move on, another one, yep, got that. Then as I'm moving down here, what you might notice, and I've highlighted here, I've only got a 1+ reaction, whereas I've got 3+ reactions up here. but this cell is heterozygous. So using your knowledge of antibodies, we know that anti-M and anti-N are antithetical, so they're sort of like the pair up, but the opposite of each other. And M classically shows dosage, so you can actually get weaker reactions. Sometimes this could even be negative. Continue on down, we've got 3+ reaction on a homozygous cell, stronger. Down to the next one, there you go, you've got a weaker reaction on your heterozygous, again showing dosage, and again this line could be negative, and then you've got your 3+ there. So this is just to show how your antibodies can work. Patient's thought was negative, so going back to your tools. Again, as I mentioned there previously, so you're thinking, yeah, this is a pretty convincing anti-M. It's reacting how I would think. It's not reacting by enzyme. We know that it's destroyed, so these are effectively antigen negative for that. You've got that knowledge and understanding of how anti-M works, that it can show dosage. Then you're thinking, right, I need to phenotype this patient. So is it an autoantibody? Is it an alloantibody? Because you can get naturally occurring antibodies as well. But in order to phenotype, you need to know what your patient's history is, because if they've been transfused, I wouldn't be able to phenotype this patient. And this person is pregnant and they've never been transfused. All good. We're going to do a phenotype on this patient. And the M negative, so I can say it's an alloanti-M. So the patient's phenotype, the AB pos, big E neg, big K neg, M neg, 26-year-old female, what blood are you going to give them? If anyone would like to have a guess. Anyone? Yeah, pretty much a perfect answer, so it's really good. You could check your own policy. Yep, XM compatible, brilliant. Really good, and it's a good time. What is the nature of IgM? Do you mean in terms of IgM antibodies and clinical significance? Yeah, I'll talk about that. Oh no, do you want to come off mute and be brave and talk? No, I'll come back to you once we've finished this. So yeah, you could. I know some places I would personally give big E neg as well, just to match, because they've made antibodies. But some places wouldn't. You don't have. They might have it so you don't have to match for RH if they've got a non-RH antibody. So just check what your local policy would be. But yeah, but CMV neg because the patient is pregnant. So you found your second antibody. So the M&S system, it's destroyed by PAPAIN, except for anti-U. And I do apologise because that would have to be a whole talk on its own, so I'm not going to go into that. Anti-M is if it's reactive by IAT, you have to give antigen negative blood. But if it's not reactive by IAT, if it was just reacting, say, cold room temperature by direct agglutination only, it's just cross-match compatible by IAT. But if it's there by IAT at 37, you have to give antigen negative blood. Anti-N, it's unlikely to be clinically significant, and these anti-M and anti-N can predominantly be IgM antibodies, but you do see them reacting at 37, which would be IgG. But it's very common to have these as cold IgM antibodies. So anti-N is just cross-match compatible by IAT. Anti-big S and anti-little s are clinically significant, whether they're reactive by IAT currently or they're just historical antibodies, and you must give antigen negative blood in those cases. It's not the same. It's more clinically significant than anti-M and anti-N. And then anti-U is a high incidence antibody within this family of antigens. It is clinically significant, and you will need antigen negative red cells. Spoiler alert, I believe that someone is coming to do a talk on anti-U at some point in the future, so we'll keep an eye out for that one. So it'll be a brilliant talk. So moving on, because again, I'm aware that time is running away with us. So for this one, I haven't gone through all the individual exclusions, I've just sort of matched them up. Hopefully you've got the same pattern of reactions that I have. So And we've got a big K here. So with big K, or KEL as we'll call it, even though you should get a slap on the wrist for saying that, this can actually show dosage as well. If you use a neutral cause, you might find that you don't get an enhanced reaction, but with enzyme IAT, you generally do tend to see an enhanced reaction with that one. O is negative, so thinking about our tools for this patient, phenotype them. You can see that it's enhanced in the terms of enzyme IAT, which I've already said. Check the transfusion history. This patient has had previous pregnancies, but they've never been transfused, so chances are they've made this antibody when they've been pregnant. And then the patient's phenotype, so they're a 57-year-old female. The raw pause, big C neg, big K neg. What blood are you going to give them? So what I would normally, I'll reply directly to you after. Sorry, I'm sort of getting little things flashing up in the front. Yeah, so this person, because they're a 57-year-old female, if they didn't have any antibodies, you wouldn't have to give them big K negative blood, but this person made anti-big K, so you are going to have to give them antigen negative blood for terms of that. And again, just check your local policy on whether you would give extended RH matched, but the guidelines do just say that extended RH match is only when you've made an RH antibody, so just check what your local policy would be for that one. And hopefully everybody got that one. So that's for third antibody. KEL system antibodies are resistant to PAPAIN. They can show dosage. Sometimes not as classically as what the likes of M can, but having done hundreds of antibody IDs, I have seen that. Anti-big K is clinically significant, and you must give antigen negative required. Roughly sort of 90% of your people are going to be big K negative, so it is easy to get blood for them. Anti-little K, so this is the sort of partner of big K. This is clinically significant as well, but this is a high incidence antibody, so like 99.9% of the population are going to be positive for this antigen. So it's a high incidence antibody should you have it, and you have to give antigen negative blood. And it could even be a frozen blood bank job if there was none around. It's not often much. Anti-KPA, this is one way it may be clinically significant. This is within the KEL family, but it's just cross-match compatible by IAT for the percentage in the donor population, as I mentioned previously. And then you have its antithetical antigen, which is anti-KPB, and similar to big little K, sorry, get the right one. That's high incidence, and you've got to give antigen negative blood for that. Again, probably a frozen blood bank job and pre-planning if you get one of those patients. So moving on to antibody 4. So this is where it gets a little bit more interesting, or I think it does anyway, because I'm really sad. So we've got JKB, so as we move down there, sorry, I'll go back one. So as we move down there and go down, move along, this is negative, great, I can exclude that. Continue on down. Remember what I was saying at the beginning about the BSH guidelines, you cannot exclude a kid antibody on a heterozygous line, it's got to be homozygous expression. So even though looking at the JKA, it's negative here, it's a heterozygous cell, so you can't exclude using that line. So you have to continue on till you get your next homozygous one, negative, that one's gone. I think for this one I've gone a bit mad and I've done them all. So you do only need one example, but sometimes it just feels nice to get shot of them all. So that's that one gone. So moving on to the next line, got a positive reaction here, looking like it could be having a think about how KID antibodies work, enhanced by enzyme. Yep, stronger reaction there. Moving on down. This one's actually showing dosage. Remember when I said previously that antibodies that show dosage, you could miss them? So it's actually negative by IAT, but it's heterozygous. So you can't say that it's not there because it just could be reacting weakly. And there's a reaction by enzyme, which would be getting me thinking that it's looking like a good chance there's a KID antibody present here. Again, moving on down, positive. There's another one. And there's another one. To me, this is looking pretty convincing. And then I just continue on with the rest of my exclusions. And I'm just going to do this very quickly for time. And I apologise if you can hear lots of clicks. So we've got to ELUATE there. And you might notice that I can't actually exclude this. So you could go on and confirm if there's antibodies there or not. But ELUATE, it's not that you're not bothered, but it's unlikely to be clinically significant, and 97% of your donor population are going to be negative for this antigen. So you can kind of just say, well, if I'm cross-matching, as long as I give cross-match compatible by IAT, I don't have to worry about this. And then for completeness, I've just excluded the rest. What you might notice, and what I hope you've noticed, is that the person's auto is positive. So we need to look at our tools. So if they've got a positive auto, I would then do a DAT and see if it's positive for IgG. I'd be starting to think, well, they've made an antibody, I'm going to phenotype them because I want to know what this is. But before I phenotype them, I need to know whether they've been transfused. An anti-JK anti-sera is IgM. So if they haven't been transfused and that's positive for IgG, I'm okay to use this reagent because it's not an IgG anti-sera, it's an IgM one. So that goes back to your knowledge of how anti-sera and antibodies work. Need a patient's history. They were transfused 3 days ago. So is anyone going to phenotype this patient? Nope. Hopefully no. But there's something else that you need to do. So we'll do with that on this patient. Turns out it's positive. So they've transfused, they've got a positive auto and a positive DET. What else are you going to need to do? You may or may not know, but you need to do an ELUATE, because what this is shown here is that your patient has Ig on their own red cells. Elution, perfect, yep. We can't do the phenotyping, so we're going to perform an ELUATE. So do the DAT's positive. This is just quickly explaining what's going on when you've got a DAT. Essentially, it would just look like this in a card, and it's just showing that there is IgG bound to your patient's red cells. What you need to remember when you're doing a DAT and a patient's been transfused is you've got your population of patient cells. So chances are the patient cells are going to be antigen negative. You're not going to have antibody bound to them. But the positive reaction is coming from the donor cells that are there, which will be antigen positive, and therefore you're going to have this positive reaction. So I'm just going to very quickly, because I know I've took longer than I thought I was going to, is what you do when you're doing ELUATE. So you essentially take a mil of your patient's red cells, which are a mix of patient and donor red cells because they've been transfused. Give them a good wash, so 4 washes in saline solution, essentially just mix them up with a pastet. And you end up with this, you end up with your packed red cells. You want to get rid of this supernatant, and then you're going to add an elutant solution. So this is an acidic solution. So you've washed off any bound antibody that would be floating, any unbound antibody floating around in the plasma. And what you're left with is packed red cells that are coated in antigen, in IgG, sorry. You elute them from the red cells, so you put the acid in, and it just encourages the antibody to come off the red cell into the solution, which is what's happened here. You take that bit of solution, and because it's acidic, if you put it straight into your red cells to perform an antibody ID, it would just lyse the cells, so you've got to add some buffer, which is blue. So once it all goes nice and blue, you just treat it like plasma and do an antibody ID. So this is what I've done here. So this isn't one of your panel sheets, just in case you're looking. I didn't give you this one. This is what I should have done the first time with the antibody ID. So, and you treat it exactly the same. So this is your ELUATE, and you just treat it in the exact same way as you would plasma. And there you go, you've got an anti-JK. But what you can't do is say whether it's an allo or an autoantibody, because you can't phenotype them. You could genotype them, but you probably wouldn't unless they had like a really good need to do that. So you're actually able to say that this patient's got a non-specified anti-JK. Because it's not specified, it's just because you don't know whether it's an allo or an auto, but chances are it's going to be, they've been transfused, they've made this antibody, you can't say, so you need to give antigen negative blood. And I've just answered the question there for you by accident. So this patient, historically, O positive, big E neg, big K neg, what blood would you give? Hopefully you would say that you are going to give RH. You can give RH match if you want, but again, check your local policy in case you don't have to. In your local policy, you've got to give big K neg because they are a female of childbearing potential, and I would give JK neg because they've made that antibody. You haven't actually excluded CW and LUA when you go back to your previous panels if you're looking at them, but again, just cross-match compatible by IAT. someone saying there, if it was C3D positive but IgG negative, you don't, it generally tends to be, if it's IgG positive, you would do an ELUATE, but you may just be wanting to double check that there's something there. But if it's C3D positive, the patient just might have like a cold autoantibody, so it would just be the call of whoever was doing that investigation. So we found for forth antibody. So kids enhanced by PAPAIN can show dosage. Kid antibodies can disappear. So you might hear that they're really dangerous, and you can see this in the little picture, it's hiding there. So you can have a high titer of, say, anti-JKA, and the next time you see the patient, it's just gone to such low levels that you can't detect it anymore. So the reason that it's dangerous, and the reason that we use enzyme IAT in reference laboratories, is because it's so hard to detect. If you transfuse someone, they made an antibody, but you didn't see them again for 2 years, you don't know that they've got that JKA. So you could give them JKA positive blood because you just can't detect it in the plasma, and then they can have a transfusion reaction. So it's really important when they've been transfused to make sure that you're doing your elutions. Anti-JKA is also my favourite antibody. I don't know if anyone else is as sad as me, but yes, I have a favourite antibody. And I used to love doing investigations where I sort of would have like a little hint of a kid antibody, and I'd just be determined that I was going to find it. Anti-JK and JKB are clinically significant, and if they've had them in the past or they're currently detected, you've got to give antigen negative blood. And you can also have an anti-JK3, which is a high incidence one in patients who are JK neg, JKB neg, and you've got to give antigen negative blood. And we will very quickly move on to our last antibody ID. So hopefully everyone's answered that. If you've got any questions and we're running out of time, just feel free to drop me an email and I will respond to you. So do more exclusions. So moving on down, that one's gone. On your next one. That one's gone, but you have only excluded it once. Again, I would probably be inclined to put up another cell, just because I'm a bit obsessed by kid antibodies. So it's looking here like we've got a Duffy B, and again you can see there that this is shown dosage, and you've got that weaker reaction. So a similar way in that your M's and your kids do it. So everything's sort of looking, and I mean I have made these panels so that they're idealised, so you can see that there's because a lot of panels might not have any heteros on, because it's almost a waste of, not a waste, but if you're not going to be able to exclude them, then it's sort of better having homozygous cells on there. Anyway, I'm rabbiting on. Then I'm just going to continue on and just click away just for speed, because I'm aware that it's nearly 2 o'clock. So I've got a Duffy B here, but we haven't excluded everything because there's something going on by enzyme. Hopefully you've got the same that I have. So this is where you start to match your patterns up. So you've got, it's big C positive there, it's negative by IAT, but there is something there by enzyme, and it's a really strong reaction. And remember that your RH antibodies are enhanced using enzymes. Then you've got your next one. You can't tell because the IAT is masked by the presence of the Duffy B, but the enzyme's there. So there's definitely looking like there's a big C there. And you've got a similar picture here where, again, it's masked, so you can't see whether it's there by IAT. But what you might have noticed, and I'm hoping that you've noticed, is line 4 is heterozygous for the C antigen. So you've got big C and little c. And yes, there's a 2+ reaction here, but in my head I'm thinking, well, that's probably due to the Duffy B, because line 1 is homozygous big C, so you would expect a stronger reaction there, and it's negative by IAT. So your options here are you can put up some more cells by IAT, so big C pos, Duffy B negative, so then that's not in the way, or you can just call it an enzyme big C, because either way you're going to be given antigen negative blood. And then just for completeness, I've excluded anti-D. Patient's auto is positive. So remember what I was saying before, it's really important. If the patient's auto is positive, we'll have to do a DET. So that's part of the tools that we're using. You also want to think about doing phenotype on your patient, but again, this is going to depend on the history. So we could use anti-Duffy B to determine if there's a Duffy B, and we need to find out what if it's big C, if it's antigen negative or positive. But we need to do a DAT. So in this case, we do a DAT and the patient's DAT is positive. What you hopefully remembered is that anti-FYB, anti-SERA is IgG. You don't know if the patient's been transfused. They haven't. Because I've just clicked ahead there. So they were last transfused 4 years ago, but they've got a positive auto, positive DAT. So you can't phenotype for the Duffy B because you would get a false positive from the IgG coated red cells on your patient because you use that bridging antibody, which will just bind anti-IgG. It'll bind IgG and it'll give you a false positive. So you can't determine what the Duffy B is going to be. But you can type the big C because that's an IgM reagent. So that's that understanding of what's going on. So then what was said with this patient is we've got the phenotype. So the O-pos, big C neg, little e neg, big K neg, 65-year-old female. You can't say what it's a Duffy B is an allo because you can't phenotype them. So you would have to call it not specified. But it's an allo big C because the patient's big C neg. And with this one, because I'm aware there's only 2 minutes, I won't ask you, you've got to give, they've made an RH antibody, so you've got to give extended RH match. So you would have to give this person R2. Wouldn't have to give them big K neg because they're a 65-year-old female, they're not of childbearing potential, but it may be your policy to give big K negative blood if they've made other allo antibodies. But again, that's not what the BSH guidelines say you've got to do, so just check your local policy. And Duffy, just a quick overview there, destroyed by PAPAIN except for anti-Duffy 3. That tends to be the case with a lot of high incidence antibodies. These two are both clinically significant and you need to give antigen negative blood. And your high incidence one, these are the ones where you're going to have to give your Duffy A neg, Duffy B neg blood. And hopefully you've all found your fantastic antibodies and I hope that talk's been okay for you. Sorry it was a little bit rushed, but it's trying to get as much out of it and get you to see the different kinds of antibody IDs within the time. So I hope it's been beneficial.